What happens when royal hatred meets impossible truth? When Queen Adelheid discovered that her most despised slave had been caught stealing from the royal treasury, she demanded the harshest punishment possible. But as she prepared to deliver her verdict in front of the entire court, King Richard burst through the doors with a confession so shocking, so unthinkable, that it would shatter everything she believed about power, bloodline, and the very foundation of their kingdom. If you love stories of shocking revelations, forbidden secrets, and plot twists that change everything, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we bring you the most incredible medieval tales every day. This is a story about hidden truths that can destroy dynasties, about the dangerous power of royal blood, and about how one moment of honesty can transform hatred into something far more complex. Stay until the end, because what the king reveals will leave you speechless, and questioning everything you thought you knew about medieval justice. The autumn morning air hung thick with tension in the grand throne room of Valenhall Castle when Queen Adelheid ascended to her judgment seat, her emerald silk gown rustling like whispered threats across the polished marble floor. Her ice-blue eyes, cold as winter frost, fixed upon the figure kneeling in chains before her, Lyra, a slave girl of barely 19 years whose dark skin bore the permanent marks of endless toil in the castle's deepest chambers. Her obviously pregnant belly strained against the coarse fabric of her simple brown tunic, adding another layer of vulnerability to her already desperate situation. The queen's perfectly sculpted features twisted with undisguised contempt as she surveyed the trembling girl who had dared to steal from the royal treasury, her hatred seeming to intensify at the sight of the slave's condition. The throne room itself was a monument to royal power and intimidation, its soaring stone arches decorated with tapestries depicting centuries of conquest and dominance. Massive stained-glass windows cast colored light across the assembled nobles, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere that made the proceedings feel both sacred and terrifying. The scent of burning incense mixed with a metallic tang of fear that always accompanied royal justice, while dozens of courtiers pressed closer to witness what promised to be a spectacle of absolute authority. Lyra of the lower chambers, Queen Adelheid's voice rang out across the vast hall with the cutting precision of a blade. You stand accused of the most heinous crime a slave can commit, theft from your royal masters, desecration of the sacred trust placed in your worthless hands. Her words dripped with venom that had been brewing for months, for this particular slave had long been a source of inexplicable irritation to the queen, though she had never been able to articulate exactly why. The sight of the girl's pregnant condition seemed to fuel her rage even further, as if the very idea of this slave carrying new life was an additional affront to royal sensibilities. The accused girl raised her head slowly, revealing features that were undeniably beautiful despite her lowly station, high cheekbones that caught the light, intelligent dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and an innate dignity that no amount of servitude had been able to completely crush. Her simple brown slave's tunic was clean but patched, stretched tight across her pregnant belly, and iron shackles marked her wrists with the permanent indentations of bondage. Even in her condition, carrying what was obviously several months of pregnancy, she maintained a composure that seemed to irritate the queen beyond measure. "Your Majesty," Lyra said quietly, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed oddly familiar to several of the older nobles present, "I do not deny that gold was found in my possession. But the circumstances of how it came to be there." She paused, seeming to struggle with words that could easily cost her life. "The truth is more complex than simple theft." Queen Adelheid's face flushed with fury at the slave's apparent insolence. "Complex?" she shrieked, rising from her throne like an avenging angel. "There is nothing complex about your crime, you worthless creature. You took what did not belong to you, violated the sacred order that keeps our kingdom functioning." Her voice echoed off the stone walls, and several courtiers stepped back in alarm at the intensity of her rage. The queen had always harbored a particular hatred for this slave that went far beyond normal aristocratic disdain for the lower classes. There was something about Lyra's presence that seemed to ignite an almost irrational fury in Adelheid's breast, a fury that the queen herself couldn't fully explain. Perhaps it was the girl's refusal to properly cower, or the way she carried herself with an unconscious grace that seemed almost noble. "I have tolerated your existence in my castle for far too long," the queen continued, beginning to pace before her throne like a caged predator. Your very presence offends me, your breathing is an insult to decent people, and now this final betrayal proves what I have always known, that some people are born to be nothing more than parasites on civilized society. The assembled nobles watched in fascination as their queen worked herself into what appeared to be a murderous frenzy. Lord Chancellor Aldrich shifted uncomfortably, while Lady Catherine whispered nervously to her companions. Even the guard seemed tense, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons as the queen's voice grew more shrill and dangerous. "The punishment for theft from the royal treasury is death," Adelheid declared with savage satisfaction. "But for you, mere death seems insufficient. You will be taken to the public square and flogged until your worthless hide hangs in ribbons, then hanged until dead, and your unborn bastard will die with you as a warning to any other slave who thinks to steal from their betters." The cruelty of condemning not just the accused but her unborn child sent shockwaves through even the most hardened courtiers. A collective gasp echoed through the throne room at the unprecedented cruelty of the proposed punishment. Even in an age when harsh justice was commonplace, the queen's sentence seemed excessive, driven more by personal vendetta than legal precedent. The nobles exchanged worried glances, for they had witnessed royal anger before, but never had they seen their usually composed queen display such vicious hatred toward a mere slave. Lyra remained kneeling, but her head was now held high with a dignity that seemed to emanate from some inner source of strength. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady despite the death sentence hanging over her like a blade, "I accept whatever punishment you deem fit, but I beg you to consider that there may be more to this situation than appears on the surface. Sometimes the truth is hidden beneath layers of deception that even the wisest rulers cannot immediately perceive." "Silence!" the queen shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "How dare you speak of truth, you lying thief? How dare you suggest that I, your queen, am incapable of perceiving reality?" She turned to address the court, her arms spread wide in theatrical fury. "Behold the arrogance of the lower classes. This creature, this piece of human refuse, presumes to lecture royalty about truth and wisdom." The assembled courtiers murmured their agreement, though several of the more observant nobles noticed something peculiar about the queen's reaction. Lady Margaret, an elderly woman who had served in the court for over 30 years, frowned thoughtfully as she studied both the queen and the accused slave. There was something in the girl's bearing, something in the way she held her head, that triggered a memory from long ago. "Your Majesty," interrupted Lord Aldrich nervously, "perhaps we should consider a more traditional punishment? While the crime is certainly serious, such an elaborate execution might be seen as—" He searched for diplomatic words. "Perhaps excessive for a first offense." Queen Adelheid whirled on him with eyes blazing. "Excessive? This worthless slave steals from the royal treasury, from the very gold that maintains our kingdom's prosperity, and you call my justice excessive?" Her voice rose to a near shriek. "Are you perhaps sympathizing with criminals now, Lord Aldrich? Should we be concerned about your loyalty to the crown?" The threat in her words was unmistakable, and Lord Aldrich immediately bowed deeply. "Of course not, Your Majesty. I merely wished to ensure that justice was both swift and appropriate to the crime." But the queen was beyond reason now, pacing back and forth before her throne like a wild animal in a cage. "This slave has been a thorn in my side since the day she arrived in this castle. There is something about her that offends my very soul, something unnatural and wrong that I cannot tolerate." She stopped suddenly and pointed a trembling finger at Lyra. "Look at her. Even now, facing death, she refuses to grovel properly. She refuses to show the appropriate fear and submission." Indeed, Lyra knelt with a composure that seemed almost regal, her dark eyes meeting the queen's gaze without flinching. It was this very composure that seemed to drive Adelheid to new heights of fury, as if the slave's dignity was a personal insult to royal authority. "Perhaps," suggested Master Geoffrey, the court's elderly treasurer, "we should hear the full details of how the gold came to be in her possession? For the sake of complete justice, Your Majesty." His voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes showed genuine concern for the proper administration of justice. "The details are irrelevant," the queen snapped. "Gold was found hidden in her quarters. What more details do we need? She is a thief, and thieves must die. But even as she spoke, several courtiers noticed a strange nervousness in her manner, as if she were eager to avoid any deeper investigation of the circumstances. The massive oak doors of the throne room stood closed and heavily guarded, their iron hinges designed to prevent any interruption of royal proceedings. The morning light streaming through the high windows had shifted as the confrontation continued, casting longer shadows across the marble floor and creating an almost ominous atmosphere in the grand chamber. The tension in the throne room continued to escalate as Queen Adelhaide's fury seemed to feed upon itself, growing more intense with each passing moment. Her perfectly arranged golden hair had begun to come loose from its elaborate styling, and her hands shook with rage as she continued her verbal assault on the kneeling slave. The assembled nobles watched in growing discomfort, many beginning to wonder if their queen had perhaps lost her rational composure entirely. 20 years, the queen declared suddenly, her voice taking on an almost confessional quality that sent chills through the watching courtiers. For 20 years I have ruled this kingdom with wisdom and strength, maintaining order and prosperity through careful judgment and decisive action. And in all that time, no slave has ever dared to challenge me so brazenly, to look upon me with such insolent dignity. She approached Lyra slowly, her silk slippers making soft sounds against the polished marble, her emerald gown trailing behind her like liquid poison. "Do you know what I see when I look at you, slave?" she hissed, leaning down until her face was mere inches from Lyra's upturned features. "I see rebellion. I see defiance. I see someone who thinks herself better than her station, who carries herself as if she has some claim to nobility." The queen's words hung in the air like an accusation, and several of the older nobles shifted uncomfortably as memories stirred in their minds. Lady Margaret in particular found herself studying Lyra's features with increasing intensity, noting the elegant bone structure, the graceful neck, the way the girl's hair caught the light despite its simple arrangement. "You want to know why I hate you so much?" Queen Adelheid continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the vast room. "It's because you remind me of something I've spent years trying to forget. You carry yourself like someone who doesn't belong in chains. And that is an insult to the natural order of our world." Lyra finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Your Majesty, I have never claimed to be anything more than what I am. I have served faithfully in your castle, asking for nothing beyond basic survival. If my manner offends you, it is not from any intention to show disrespect, but simply because I cannot change the person I was born to be." "The person you were born to be," the queen repeated, her voice rising dangerously. "You were born to be a slave. That is your nature, your destiny, your entire purpose for existing. You have no right to be anything else." But even as she spoke these words, Queen Adelhaide's face showed a flicker of something that might have been uncertainty. The way Lyra held herself, the cadence of her speech, even the angle of her chin as she faced potential death. There was something hauntingly familiar about it all. Master Geoffrey stepped forward cautiously. "Your Majesty, if I may suggest proceeding with the formal questioning? For the official record, we should establish exactly how the gold came to be in the prisoner's possession, when it was discovered, and by whom." "I said the details don't matter," the queen snapped, but her protest seemed weaker now, as if some of her earlier certainty had begun to crack. "The gold was found, that's enough." "But your Majesty," Lady Margaret interjected with the privilege of her advanced age and long service, "surely justice requires a complete understanding of the circumstances? What if there were mitigating factors?" The queen's eyes flashed dangerously. What mitigating factors could possibly excuse theft from the royal treasury? What possible justification could this creature offer for her crime? It was then that Lyra raised her head fully, meeting the queen's gaze with eyes that held depths of sadness and knowledge that seemed far beyond her years. "Your Majesty, the gold was not stolen in the way you believe. It was given to me, by someone who claimed he had the right to give it." "Given to you?" the queen scoffed. "By whom? What person in this castle would dare give royal gold to a slave?" Lyra hesitated, glancing around the assembled court as if weighing her words carefully. The person who gave it to me claimed that it was rightfully mine by birth, that I had more claim to it than anyone realized. A deadly silence fell over the throne room. Queen Adelhaide's face had gone pale, and her hands were now visibly trembling. "By birth," she whispered. "What do you mean, by birth?" But before Lyra could answer, the massive oak doors of the throne room burst open with a thunderous crash that echoed through the chamber like a cannon blast. The enormous doors of the throne room exploded inward with such violent force that the heavy iron hinges groaned in protest, and the sound reverberated through the stone chamber like thunder announcing the arrival of a storm. Every head in the room turned toward the dramatic entrance as King Richard himself strode through the doorway, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and his face bearing an expression of desperate urgency that sent immediate alarm through the assembled court. The king's normally perfect golden hair was wild and unkempt, as if he had been running his hands through it repeatedly, and his royal blue doublet was askew, the silver buttons fastened incorrectly in his obvious haste. His boots echoed against the marble floor with each determined step, and his piercing gray eyes swept the room until they fixed upon the scene before the throne, his wife standing over the chained slave girl with murder in her eyes. "Stop!" King Richard commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of 2 decades of rule. But underneath the royal command was an undertone of something that sounded almost like panic. "Stop this proceeding immediately. No sentence will be passed today, no punishment will be carried out." Queen Adelheid whirled to face her husband, her emerald gown swirling around her like liquid fury. "Richard? What is the meaning of this interruption? I am conducting a legal proceeding, dispensing justice for a crime against the crown itself." Her voice carried both confusion and anger at this unprecedented interference with her judicial authority. "Justice?" The king's laugh was bitter and hollow, echoing strangely in the vast chamber. "My dear wife, if you proceed with this justice, you will commit a crime far greater than any theft." He moved closer to the center of the room, his eyes never leaving Lyra's upturned face, and several courtiers noticed that his hands were shaking visibly. "What are you talking about?" Queen Adelheid demanded, her voice rising to a near shriek. "This slave stole from our treasury. She was caught with royal gold in her possession. The punishment for such a crime is clear and well established." King Richard stopped directly in front of Lyra, staring down at her with an expression of profound anguish mixed with something that looked remarkably like recognition. "She did not steal that gold, Adelheid. It was given to her. By me." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the throne room, every word carried to the farthest corners. A collective gasp rose from the assembled nobles, and Queen Adelheid staggered backward as if physically struck. You gave gold to this slave? Why would you?" "Richard, what possible reason could you have for such an action?" The king closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage for words that would change everything. When he opened them again, they were filled with a mixture of shame, sorrow, and desperate resolve. "Because, my dear wife, this young woman is not merely a slave. She is my daughter." The king's eyes moved to Lyra's pregnant belly, and his voice cracked with additional anguish. "And the child she carries my grandchild, my royal blood, within her womb." The words fell into the throne room like stones dropped into a perfectly still pond, creating ripples of shock that spread outward through the assembled court. Several ladies gasped audibly, Lord Aldrich's face went completely white, and Lady Margaret suddenly pressed her hand to her mouth as long-suppressed memories crashed back into her consciousness. Queen Adelhide's face cycled through a rainbow of emotions: disbelief, horror, rage, and something approaching madness. Your daughter," she stammered, her voice barely recognizable. "That's impossible. I know every one of your legitimate children. This creature, this slave, is my bastard daughter," King Richard continued relentlessly, each word seemingly torn from his soul. "Born 20 years ago to Maria Santos, a noblewoman from the southern provinces whom I loved before our marriage was arranged. I thought the child had died in infancy, as I was told. Only recently did I discover that she had been sold into slavery, and eventually brought to our own castle. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming the entire nature of the scene. Lyra, still kneeling in her chains, stared up at the king with eyes wide with shock and dawning understanding. The assembled nobles stood frozen, afraid to speak or move as they witnessed the unraveling of royal secrets that could shake the very foundations of the kingdom. When I realized who she was, the king continued, his voice growing stronger as the truth poured out of him, I gave her some gold from my personal treasury, not as charity to a slave, but as a pathetic attempt to acknowledge a daughter I failed to protect, failed to save from 20 years of bondage. Queen Adelhaide's carefully controlled composure finally shattered completely. 20 years, she shrieked. You've known about this bastard for 20 years and said nothing? You've let me unknowingly house your illegitimate child in my own castle? You've watched me treat her as a slave when she carries royal blood. I only discovered her identity 3 days ago, the king said quietly. Master Geoffrey brought me reports of unusual expenditures from the personal treasury, and when I investigated, I found the records of the gold I had given her. That led me to finally ask the questions I should have asked 20 years ago. The revelation continued to reverberate through the throne room like aftershocks from an earthquake, each new understanding shifting the ground beneath everyone's feet. Queen Adelheid stood motionless, her face a mask of conflicting emotions as she processed the magnitude of what her husband had just revealed. The assembled nobles remained frozen in place, afraid to speak or even breathe too loudly as they witnessed the unraveling of royal secrets that could destabilize the entire kingdom. 3 days, Queen Adelheid repeated, her voice hollow and distant. For 3 days you've known that she. She gestured helplessly toward Lyra, unable to complete the sentence. And you said nothing to me? You allowed me to continue believing she was nothing more than a common thief. King Richard's shoulders sagged under the weight of his confession. I needed time to verify the truth, to be absolutely certain before making such a devastating revelation. I had Master Geoffrey conduct a thorough investigation into the historical records, trace the lineage, confirm what I had begun to suspect. He looked down at Lyra with eyes filled with paternal anguish. I also needed time to figure out how to tell you, how to explain 20 years of unknowing cruelty to my own blood. Lady Margaret stepped forward with the careful dignity of her advanced age and long court service. Your Majesty, she said softly, if I may, I remember Lady Maria Santos. She was indeed a woman of extraordinary beauty and grace. And now that the truth has been spoken, she gazed at Lyra with new understanding. The resemblance is unmistakable. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, even the way she carries herself despite her circumstances. Other nobles began murmuring their agreement as they looked at Lyra with fresh perspective. What they had dismissed as unusual dignity for a slave now appeared as the natural bearing of someone born to nobility. Her features, viewed through the lens of this revelation, clearly showed the strong bones and aristocratic bearing that marked her royal heritage. This changes everything, Lord Aldrich said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. If she is truly of royal blood, then her treatment, her status. He trailed off, clearly understanding the enormous implications of the situation. Queen Adelheid suddenly laughed, a sound sharp and bitter as broken glass. Changes everything? Yes, I suppose it does. She turned to stare at Lyra with new eyes, seeing not a despised slave but a living reminder of her husband's past love, a bastard daughter who carried royal blood through her veins. 20 years I've unknowingly harbored my husband's illegitimate child. 20 years I've treated a princess as a slave. She is not a princess, King Richard said firmly, though his voice carried obvious pain. She is illegitimate, without claim to succession or royal title. But she is my daughter, and she deserves acknowledgement of her true parentage, protection from harm, and a life befitting her bloodline. Lyra finally found her voice, speaking for the first time since the shocking revelation. Your Majesty, she said to the king, her musical voice now clearly carrying echoes of royal breeding. I never knew. In all my years of servitude, I never suspected that I might be. That you might be. She struggled with words that seemed too large for her previous understanding of herself. My child, the king said gently, kneeling beside her despite the impropriety of a monarch kneeling before anyone, even his own daughter. My lost child, whom I failed to protect, failed to save from a life of bondage and suffering. His hands trembled as he reached for her shackles. No daughter of mine, legitimate or otherwise, should wear chains in her father's castle. Queen Adelheid watched this interaction with an expression that shifted between horror and fascination. And what am I supposed to do with this knowledge? She asked, her voice eerily calm. How am I supposed to process the fact that the slave I most despised, whose very presence filled me with inexplicable rage, is actually my husband's blood? Perhaps, suggested Father Benedict, the court chaplain who had remained silent until now, your instinctive reaction was not hatred but recognition. Perhaps your soul knew what your mind could not accept, that royal blood calls to royal blood, even across the barriers of circumstance and ignorance. The queen's face twisted with bitter irony. Recognition. I wanted her dead, father. I was moments away from ordering the most brutal execution I could devise. If that was recognition, then what does it say about my nature? King Richard rose slowly, having unlocked Lyra's shackles with his own hands. It says that even the wisest among us can be deceived by appearances, can mistake the truth when it's hidden beneath layers of false assumption. He helped his daughter to her feet, and the assembled court could see clearly how the simple act of removing her chains seemed to transform her bearing entirely. But what now? Queen Adelheid asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine desperation. How do we proceed from this moment? How do we undo 20 years of unknowing sin? Standing now without her chains, her pregnant form more visible and dignified, Lyra seemed to transform before the court's eyes like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. The removal of the iron shackles had done more than free her wrists. It had freed something in her spirit that had been carefully suppressed throughout 20 years of bondage. Her posture straightened with natural grace, her chin lifted with unconscious nobility, and even her pregnant condition seemed to take on new meaning, no longer the burden of a slave, but the sacred duty of a woman carrying royal lineage. Queen Adelheid found herself staring at this transformation with a mixture of fascination and growing horror. Look at her, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Without the chains, without the slave's posture. God in heaven, she looks. She couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone present could see what she meant. Freed from the physical and psychological constraints of slavery, Lyra clearly bore the unmistakable marks of royal bloodline. She looks like her mother, King Richard said softly, his voice thick with emotion and memory. Maria had that same grace, that same natural dignity that no amount of adversity could diminish. I see it now, see how blind I was not to recognize my own daughter, my own blood. He turned to address the assembled court. I have committed a grievous sin, not just of adultery, but of abandonment. I failed to protect my child, failed to ensure her safety and welfare. Lord Chancellor Aldrich cleared his throat nervously. Your Majesty, the legal implications of this revelation are substantial. If she is truly your daughter, then certain rights attach to her bloodline, regardless of the circumstances of her birth. She cannot simply continue as a slave now that her parentage has been acknowledged. Rights. Queen Adelheid's voice carried a dangerous edge. What rights does a bastard have in this kingdom? What claim can she possibly make upon our resources, our attention, our lives? But even as she spoke these words, her eyes continued to study Lyra's face, searching for resemblances she had been blind to before. Master Geoffrey stepped forward with the careful precision of a man who dealt in facts and figures. Your Majesty, while illegitimate children have no claim to succession, established precedent does grant them certain protections under royal law. They cannot be sold, enslaved, or executed without formal trial and royal approval. Moreover, the king has the authority to grant them titles, lands, and financial support as he sees fit. The assembled nobles murmured amongst themselves as they processed these legal realities. Several of them were clearly recalculating their own relationships and obligations in light of this new understanding of Lyra's true status. "And what of the gold?" Queen Adelheid asked suddenly, her voice sharp with renewed suspicion. If it was given to her by right of blood rather than stolen by a slave, then the entire premise of this trial was false. She stands here, accused of a crime that was never committed. King Richard nodded gravely. The charges must be dropped immediately. More than that, formal apologies must be made, reparations offered for 20 years of wrongful bondage. He looked directly at his wife. "We have committed injustices that will require significant effort to address." "We." Queen Adelheid's voice rose dangerously. "I was acting based on incomplete information. I had no knowledge of her true parentage. If anyone bears responsibility for these injustices, it is the king who abandoned his daughter to slavery in the first place." The accusation hung in the air like a blade, and King Richard's face showed that the words had found their mark. "You are absolutely correct," he said quietly. "The ultimate responsibility lies with me. I should have searched for her, should have ensured her safety regardless of the political complications her existence might create." Lady Margaret approached Lyra with the careful respect due to newly revealed nobility. "My dear child," she said gently, "how do you feel about these revelations? This must be overwhelming beyond imagination." Lyra spoke carefully, her voice carrying new authority even as she remained respectful. "My lady, I confess that I am struggling to understand this new reality. For 20 years I have known myself as nothing more than a slave, told that my worth was measured only by my labor. To discover that I carry royal blood, that I am daughter to the king himself." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "It explains certain things I never understood about myself, why I sometimes felt disconnected from my circumstances, why I carried dreams and aspirations that seemed inappropriate for my station." "Dreams and aspirations?" Queen Adelheid asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity despite her obvious turmoil. "What dreams could a slave dare to harbor?" "Dreams of learning to read and write, Your Majesty. Dreams of understanding the world beyond the castle walls. Dreams of someday having the freedom to choose my own path in life." Lyra's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "Dreams that I was told were foolish and above my station, but which now seem, perhaps not so impossible after all." The king listened to his daughter speak with obvious pride mixed with profound regret. "Those dreams were your birthright," he said firmly. "Royal blood carries with it not just privileges but aspirations toward knowledge, leadership, and the betterment of society. Your dreams were never inappropriate, they were the natural expression of your true nature." "But what happens now?" Queen Adelheid asked, her voice carrying a mixture of desperation and resignation. "How do we integrate this knowledge into our lives, our court, our kingdom? How do I treat the slave I despised as my stepdaughter?"
The question hung heavy in the throne room's charged atmosphere as Queen Adelheid confronted the most difficult challenge of her reign, not a foreign invasion or political conspiracy, but the complete reframing of her own understanding of justice, family, and her role as both queen and woman. The assembled court watched in fascination as their usually composed monarch struggled with emotions and realizations that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained royal composure. King Richard moved closer to his wife, his face showing the weight of decades of accumulated guilt and the desperate hope for some kind of redemption. "Adelheid, I know this revelation has shattered your understanding of our life together. I know that discovering you've unknowingly harbored my illegitimate daughter, that you've treated my blood as a slave, must feel like the cruelest form of deception." His voice carried genuine anguish as he spoke. "But I hope you can find it in your heart to help me make amends for 20 years of abandonment and injustice." Queen Adelheid stared at Lyra for a long moment, her ice-blue eyes studying every detail of the young woman's face as if seeing her for the first time. 20 years, she repeated softly. 20 years of hating someone whose only crime was existing, was carrying blood that connected her to my husband's past. She paused, her voice becoming barely audible. 20 years of feeling an inexplicable fury whenever I looked at her, never understanding that what I was really seeing was a living reminder of love that preceded me. The honest admission sent ripples of shock through the assembled nobles. Royal marriages were political arrangements, but Queen Adelhaide's words revealed depths of personal feeling that were rarely acknowledged in court settings. "Your Majesty," Lyra said carefully, her newly revealed status giving her the courage to speak more directly than ever before, "I bear you no ill will for your treatment of me. You acted based on the information you possessed, and the circumstances of my parentage were hidden from everyone, including myself. Perhaps we might both be victims of the same deception, the same failure to protect what should have been protected." The wisdom in her words, the mature perspective that looked beyond personal grievance toward broader understanding, marked her clearly as worthy of her royal bloodline. Several courtiers exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing that this young woman possessed not just royal blood but the character traits necessary for leadership. Queen Adelhaide's expression began to shift, the rigid mask of fury and hatred slowly giving way to something more complex and human. "You speak with remarkable grace for someone who has endured 20 years of unjust bondage," she said quietly. Perhaps the royal blood in your veins has given you wisdom that I have been lacking." Father Benedict stepped forward with the moral authority of his position. "Your Majesties, we stand at a crossroads where past wrongs can either be compounded by present anger or redeemed through present mercy. The revelation of Lady Lyra's true parentage offers an opportunity for justice, healing, and the demonstration of royal virtue." "Lady Lyra?" Queen Adelheid repeated, testing the title on her tongue. "Yes, I suppose she must be styled as a lady now, mustn't she? The illegitimate daughter of a king cannot remain without title or acknowledgement." She looked directly at Lyra. "But what title? What position? What role does a bastard princess play in an established royal court?" King Richard had clearly been considering this question. "I propose to grant her the title of Lady Lyra, Duchess of Millbrook, with lands sufficient to maintain her dignity and independence. She will be acknowledged as my daughter, with all the protections and considerations that status entails, but without any claim to succession."
The generous proposal surprised many of the nobles, but Queen Adelheid nodded slowly. "A duchy. Yes, that seems appropriate. It acknowledges her blood while maintaining the integrity of the succession." She paused, then added with obvious difficulty, "And I will need time to adjust to this new reality. 20 years of hatred cannot be erased in a single moment, but perhaps they can be overcome through conscious effort and goodwill." Lyra stepped forward and, to everyone's amazement, curtsied deeply to Queen Adelheid. "Your Majesty, I ask for nothing more than the opportunity to prove myself worthy of your eventual acceptance. I understand that my existence complicates your life in ways I cannot fully comprehend, but I hope that in time, we might find a way to coexist with mutual respect if not affection." The gesture, the words, the obvious attempt to ease the Queen's burden rather than compound it, seemed to break through the last of Adelheide's resistance. For the first time since the revelation began, she smiled, a small, tentative expression, but genuine nonetheless. "Perhaps," she said softly, "we might begin with mutual respect and see where it leads us." She looked around the assembled court. "Let it be recorded that Lady Lyra, natural daughter of King Richard, has been granted full pardons for all previous charges, has been elevated to the rank of Duchess of Millbrook, and is to be treated with the dignity befitting her blood and her character." The transformation was complete. In the span of a single morning, the throne room had witnessed the unraveling of 20 years of deception, the revelation of royal secrets that could have torn the kingdom apart, and, ultimately, the triumph of truth and mercy over hatred and ignorance. As the court began to disperse, buzzing with excitement over the unprecedented revelations they had witnessed, Queen Adelheid approached Lyra one final time. "Your Grace," she said, using the new title with careful precision, "I have one question that I must ask. In all your years of service, did you ever suspect your true parentage? Was there ever a moment when you wondered about your origins?" Lyra considered the question carefully. "Your Majesty, there were times when I felt different. Times when I dreamed of things beyond my station, when I felt drawn to books and learning despite having no formal education. But I attributed these feelings to foolish pride, and I worked to suppress them. She paused. Perhaps the blood knows, even when the mind does not understand. Queen Adelheid nodded slowly. Perhaps it does. And perhaps that explains why I felt such inexplicable fury in your presence. Not hatred for a slave, but recognition of a rival for my husband's attention, even one from the distant past. The honest admission marked a new beginning for both women. The slave who had been despised was now revealed as a duchess, the queen who had harbored hatred was learning the power of mercy, and the king who had failed to protect his daughter 20 years ago was finally able to acknowledge her with the honor she deserved. In the months that followed, Lady Lyra proved herself worthy of her elevation. Her natural intelligence, refined through years of careful observation and self-education, flourished when given proper tutoring. Her compassion, deepened by personal suffering, made her a beloved figure among the common people. And her wisdom, born from experiencing both the lowest and highest stations in life, made her an invaluable advisor to the crown. The story of the slave who became a duchess, of hatred transformed into understanding, and of royal secrets revealed in the name of justice, became legend throughout the kingdom. It served as a reminder that truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually find its way to light, and that mercy is often the strongest foundation upon which to build a lasting peace.